What if Harry died in the forest? Welcome to a dystopia where Voldemort won, and a grieving Auror joins a hardened Ron and Hermione to burn his empire down. Before we step into the darkness, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and sound off in the comments to join the resistance. The sky above London was supposed to be black at midnight, but tonight, it burned an unnatural, sickly emerald. Elias Thorne operated into the alleyway just off Charing Cross Road, stumbling as his boots hit the rain-slicked cobblestones. He crashed against the brick wall, gasping for air that tasted overwhelmingly of sulfur and ozone. The metallic tang of blood coated his tongue. Above him, the dark mark was branded into the heavens, a colossal skull with a serpent writhing from its maw, casting a grim, green luminescence over the terrorized city. The Ministry had fallen, but that wasn't the worst of it. The whispers had started in the Ministry atrium just before the ward shattered, rippling through the defending Aurors like a physical shockwave. By the time Elias had fought his way to the apparition point, the whispers had become a deafening, horrifying truth, broadcasted through the magically enhanced voice of the Dark Lord himself. Harry Potter is dead. The words echoed in Elias's mind, a relentless drumbeat of despair. The boy who lived had failed in the Forbidden Forest. The Battle of Hogwarts was lost, and with it, the final bastion of hope in Britain. Now, Voldemort's forces were sweeping across the country, indiscriminately slaughtering anyone with ties to the Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry's resistance, or Muggle heritage. Elias was an Auror. He was a known blood traitor, which meant his wife, Clara, and their 4-year-old son, Leo, were prime targets. "Please no," Elias muttered, pushing himself off the wall. He gripped his wand, a flexible length of ash and dragon heartstring, so tightly his knuckles turned white. He moved through the shadows of the city, like a ghost. London was in absolute chaos. Muggles were screaming, completely oblivious to the magical war spilling into their streets. Shop windows were shattering under the force of errant curses. Death Eaters soared overhead on broomsticks and trails of black smoke, raining fire down upon the fleeing populace. Elias deflected a stray reductor curse into a parked car, the explosion masking his sprint across an open intersection. He didn't stop to help the wounded, he couldn't. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Islington. I just need to get to Islington. His neighborhood was heavily warded, hidden behind a Fidelius charm. But with the Ministry's registry compromised and the Death Eaters operating with absolute impunity, Elias knew that no magic was truly safe tonight. As he neared the edge of his street, a horrifying chill settled over the air. The rain turned to sleet. The street lamps flickered and died one by one, plunging the road into an oppressive, suffocating darkness. Elias's breath plumed in the freezing air. Dementors. They had released the Dementors into the city. Fighting the rising tide of hopeless dread, Elias forced happy memories to the forefront of his mind. Clara's laugh on their wedding day, Leo's tiny fingers wrapping around a toy broomstick. Expecto Patronum, he roared. A brilliant silver wolf erupted from the tip of his wand, charging down the street and scattering the cloaked horrors. Elias sprinted behind his Patronus, his eyes locked on the space between number 12 and number 14. Number 13, his home, was supposed to be invisible, but as the silver light of his wolf illuminated the street, Elias's world shattered. Number 13 was fully visible. The front door was blasted off its hinges, and thick, black smoke was billowing from the shattered nursery window on the second floor. The wards were broken. They were already inside. Elias didn't remember climbing the stairs. He only remembered the heavy, suffocating scent of dark magic that clung to the walls of his home. Family portraits were scorched, their magical occupants fleeing to the edges of their frames in silent terror. He gripped his wand, his heart screaming in his chest, as he reached the landing. The door to the nursery was ajar. A cold, cruel voice drifted out, cutting through the crackle of burning wallpaper. "It is a pity," the voice drawled, smooth and entirely devoid of empathy. "The Dark Lord offered a new world, yet you people insist on clinging to the filth." Elias kicked the door open, dropping into a dueling stance. "Expelliarmus," he bellowed. The red jet of light struck the dark figure standing in the center of the room, but the man didn't even flinch. He simply swatted the spell away with a lazy flick of his wand, as if brushing off a fly. The man turned. He was tall, dressed in immaculate, midnight black robes, his face obscured by a gleaming silver mask. But Elias knew the posture, the arrogance. Silas Vane. A rising star in the inner circle, a zealot who treated the purity of magical blood like a divine mandate.
Ah.
The aura returns. Vane sneered from behind his mask. Elias's eyes darted past Vane, and his breath caught in his throat. Clara was on the floor, clutching Leo desperately to her chest. She was weeping, a nasty gash bleeding freely across her forehead, but her eyes blazed with defiance when she saw her husband. "Elias, run!" Clara screamed. "Let them go, Vane." Elias roared, leveling his wand at the Death Eater's chest. "Take me. I'm the one you want." Vane chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I want you all, Thorne. But you, I want you to watch." Before Elias could cast, before he could even blink, Vane snapped his wand toward Clara and Leo. The incantation was whispered, but it echoed in the small room like a thunderclap. Avada Kedavra. A flash of blinding, horrible green light filled the nursery. It hit Clara square in the back, the magic violently rippling through her and into the small boy she held. They didn't scream. They simply went rigid, the life instantly severed from their bodies, before collapsing lifelessly to the floor. "No!" Elias's scream tore his throat raw. It wasn't a human sound. It was the howl of a wounded animal. He threw himself forward, casting blindly, desperately, blasting curses, cutting hexes, anything to tear Vane apart. Vane deflected the barrage with alarming ease. "Pathetic," he spat. Vane twirled his wand and pointed it upward at the ceiling. "Confringo." The blast hit the heavy oak support beams above Elias. The ceiling groaned, violently splintering, before the entire roof caved in. Bricks, heavy timber, and burning shingles rained down. Elias tried to shield himself, but a massive beam caught his shoulder, throwing him violently to the floor. As the debris buried him, he heard a sickening snap. A sharp, burning agony shot up his arm. His ash wand. It had snapped clean in two beneath the crushing weight of the rubble. Through the suffocating dust and the narrow gaps in the wreckage, Elias watched helplessly as Vane stepped over the bodies of his wife and child. The Death Eater didn't even look down. He simply apparated away with a sharp crack, leaving Elias buried alive in the burning tomb of his own home. Darkness took him, but the green flash of the killing curse burned permanently into the back of his eyelids. 6 months. 6 months since the boy who died. 6 months since the sky over London turned permanently gray, choked by the Dementor breeding grounds established in the ruins of the Ministry. 6 months since Elias Thorne died under the rubble of his home, and a hollow, bloodthirsty shell crawled out in his place. London was a graveyard. The Diagon Alley cobblestones were stained permanently brown from public executions. Muggle-borns were hunted for sport by snatchers, and the prophet printed nothing but the Dark Lord's mandates. Elias sat in the darkest corner of the leaky cauldron. The pub, once a hub of warmth and laughter, was now a miserable den for scavengers, thieves, and informants. Tom the innkeeper was dead, replaced by a squat, ugly Death Eater sympathizer who charged exorbitant prices for watered-down fire whiskey. Elias wore a heavy, ragged coat, the hood pulled low to hide the jagged scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw, a gift from the falling timber. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, his right hand tightly gripping a scavenged hawthorn wand he had pried from the cold fingers of a dead snatcher. It didn't belong to him. It fought his magic, making every spell an effort of sheer willpower, but it was enough to kill. A man slid into the booth opposite Elias. He was twitchy, smelling strongly of stale tobacco and rotten fish.
Briggs.
A smuggler who operated in the blackest parts of the magical black market. "You got the capital?" Briggs muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the bar. Elias didn't speak. He reached into his coat and slid a heavy, velvet-wrapped object across the sticky wooden table. Briggs snatched it, peeling back the velvet to reveal a gleaming, ancient goblin-wrought dagger. It was a Thorne family heirloom, the only thing Elias had managed to dig out of the ashes of his home. Briggs whistled softly. Genuine silver. Goblin-made. This'll fetch a pretty galleon on the continent. The port key, Elias growled. His voice was a rasping scrape of gravel, and used to casual conversation. Briggs smirked, pocketing the dagger. He reached into his own coat and produced a rusty, bent muggle bottle cap. He slid it across the table. Activates at midnight, Briggs whispered. Coordinates are set for Brooklyn, New York. But I gotta warn you, mate, the grass ain't greener across the pond. Word on the streets is that he who must not be named sent his best dog to put the American Congress on a leash. I know, Elias said softly. Silas Vane is an inner-circle butcher, Briggs continued, leaning in. They say MACUSA is already crumbling from the inside. Why the bloody hell would you want to go there? Elias picked up the rusty bottle cap, his grip tightening until the metal bit into his palm. He looked up, locking eyes with the smuggler. His gaze was dead, entirely devoid of light or fear. Because Vane is there, Elias said. He didn't wait for response. He stood up, blending into the shadows of the pub, and stepped out into the freezing London rain. He had nothing left to protect. He had no ideals left to uphold. The order was shattered. Harry Potter was a martyr in a lost war. All Elias had left was the burning, singular desire to watch Silas Vane choke on his own blood. And if he had to cross an ocean and tear down an entire continent to do it, he would. Midnight arrived with a sickening jerk behind the navel. Elias slammed into the ground, sliding across a grimy, damp concrete floor. He choked on a cloud of dust, immediately rolling to his feet, his scavenged hawthorn wand raised and glowing with a faint, aggressive orange light. He was in an abandoned warehouse. Moonlight filtered through shattered skylights, illuminating rusted machinery and crates covered in years of untouched rot. The air was heavy, smelling of salt, pollution, and the faint, unmistakable tang of dark magic lingering in the atmosphere. Brooklyn. Elias moved to the nearest grime-caked window and peered out. The skyline of New York City loomed in the distance, a sprawling forest of glass and steel. But something was deeply wrong. To the Muggle eye, it was just a city at night. To Elias's magically attuned senses, the city was bleeding. Massive, invisible wards that usually blanketed the magical enclaves of the city were flickering erratically, like a dying heartbeat. Plumes of magical smoke, invisible to no mages, rose from various districts, indicating recent skirmishes or fires. Vane had only been here for 3 months, and he was already tearing MACUSA apart. Elias slipped out of the warehouse, wrapping his coat tight against the bitter November wind. He needed to find the underground. The rumors in London stated that while MACUSA was falling to bureaucratic infiltration and targeted assassinations, a gritty, unofficial resistance was forming in the shadows of the city. He navigated the streets carefully, sticking to the alleys and avoiding the main no-mage thoroughfares. The magical integration in America was vastly different from Britain. The segregation was absolute. Because of Rappaport's law, witches and wizards here lived deeply underground. But tonight, that secrecy felt less like a law and more like a desperate survival tactic. As he passed a darkened alleyway, Elias noticed a faint, pulsating magical rune etched into the brickwork. It was an old Auror distress signal, modified. He traced his wand over it. The brick shimmered, revealing a battered magical wireless radio hidden in a recess. The radio was hissing with static, but a frantic, clipped voice broke through. Repeating, the MACUSA Auror headquarters in the Woolworth building has been compromised. The president is missing. Inner Circle forces are currently purging the lower levels. Do not attempt to access the building. I repeat, do not. The broadcast abruptly cut to violent static, followed by the chilling sound of dark laughter. Elias crushed the radio beneath his boot. There was no official government left to help him. Not that he wanted their help anyway. He was a lone operative now. He moved toward the nearest subway station, the steps leading down into the subterranean belly of the city. The underground tunnels were a labyrinth, a perfect place for refugees and resistance fighters to hide from airborne patrols. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. As he descended into the flickering fluorescent gloom of the station, Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air pressure dropped. The unmistakable scent of ozone and stale blood hit his nose. He wasn't alone in the dark. The subway platform was eerily silent. A rusted train car sat abandoned on the tracks, covered in graffiti. Elias walked slowly, his boots crunching lightly on broken glass. He kept his wand low, his eyes scanning the deep shadows between the concrete pillars. "Hold it right there, Limey." The voice echoed from the far end of the platform. A man stepped out of the shadows, wearing a heavy leather duster and holding a wand lazily in his hand. Two more figures dropped from the rafters behind Elias, cutting off his exit. Snatchers. Mercenaries hired by the new regime. They looked like a mix of American defectors and British imports, drawn by the promise of galleons and unrestrained violence. "You smell like over the pond," the leader said, stepping into the flickering light. He had a brutal, scarred face and a jagged smile. "Curfew was 3 hours ago. Wands are subject to immediate confiscation by order of the Envoy." "Come and take it," Elias rasped, his eyes locking onto the leader's chest. The leader sneered. "Have it your way. Stupefy." Elias didn't bother shielding. He dropped to his knees, letting the red jet of light shatter against a pillar behind him, and fired back. Sectum Sempra. He didn't hold back. The dark cutting curse ripped from his hawthorn wand. It struck the leader in the shoulder, tearing through his leather duster and flesh in a spray of crimson. The man screamed, collapsing to the floor. The other two snatchers opened fire immediately. Curses flew through the air, illuminating the dirty subway station in flashes of sickly yellow and green. Elias rolled behind a metal trash can, returning fire with aggressive, concussive blasts. The hawthorn wand was resisting him, sparking wildly, throwing off his aim. "I'm pinned," Elias realized, breathing heavily as a blasting curse melted the metal of his cover. He prepared to make a suicidal rush. If he was going to die in a foreign subway, he would take at least one more of them with him. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous explosion rocked the platform. A barrage of spells erupted from the absolute darkness of the tunnel itself. They weren't standard dueling spells. They were ruthless, highly precise, and devastatingly lethal. A blinding streak of purple light struck one of the snatchers, sending him violently crashing through the windows of the abandoned train car. A second spell, a localized concussive wave, slammed the remaining snatcher against the concrete wall with a sickening crunch. He slid down motionless. Silence fell over the platform, save for the groaning of the wounded leader bleeding out on the tiles. Elias stayed behind his cover, his wand raised toward the tunnel. "Show yourself," he demanded. Footsteps echoed from the dark. Two figures emerged into the dim light. Elias lowered his wand, his eyes widening in absolute shock. The ghosts of his past had somehow manifested in the Brooklyn underground. The man was tall, his red hair dirty and unkempt. The left side of his face was heavily scarred, and one of his ears was missing. He wore tactical nomage gear mixed with dragonhide armor, and his blue eyes, once warm and full of humor, were as cold and hard as steel. Beside him stood a woman, her bushy brown hair tied tightly back. She held her wand with lethal precision. There was no trace of the bright, rule-abiding student Elias remembered from passing in the ministry halls. Her gaze was calculating, sharp enough to cut glass, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger. They looked at Elias, their wands still raised. Hermione stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied his scarred face. "Elias Thorne," Hermione said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You're supposed to be dead under a house in Islington." "So is the order," Elias replied, slowly stepping out from his cover. "Yet here you are." Ron kicked the wand away from the dying snatcher leader, without looking down. "The order died with Harry," Ron said gruffly, his voice gravelly and hollow. "This is something else. What are you doing in New York, Thorne?" I'm hunting Silas Vane, Elias said simply. Hermione and Ron exchanged a brief, unreadable look. Hermione lowered her wand marginally. If you're hunting Vane, Hermione said, turning back to the dark tunnel, then you're going to need a bigger gun. Come with us. And keep your wand sheathed, or Ron will take your hand off. Elias looked at the brutalized bodies of the Snatchers, then back to the hardened leaders of the resistance. The war hadn't just broken him. It had broken them all. Without a word, he fell into step behind them, descending deeper into the American dark. The descent into the Resistance's headquarters was a journey backward through time. Ron and Hermione led Elias past the modern, tiled walls of the active subway lines, slipping through a magically concealed fissure in the concrete that plunged them into the forgotten, skeletal remains of the 1920s transit system. The air here was suffocatingly dry, smelling of rust, old copper, and the lingering ghosts of a bygone era. They emerged into what used to be a Prohibition-era speakeasy, seamlessly integrated into an abandoned station. Tarnished brass chandeliers, lit by ever-burning bluebell flames, cast long, flickering shadows over walls lined with cracked mirrors and rotting velvet booths. The room hummed with a tense, chaotic energy. Dozens of witches and wizards, some wearing tattered MACUSA Auror robes, others in heavily modified Muggle tactical gear, moved frantically between makeshift workstations. Healing potions bubbled in cracked cauldrons over open fires, and the clatter of frantic telegraphs, enchanted to bypass magical jamming, echoed incessantly. Hermione gestured toward a large, circular table in the center of the room. Spread across it was a massive, glowing map of North America. Black tendrils of dark magic pulsed over major cities, spreading like necrosis across a dying body. "Welcome to the Blind Pig," Hermione said, her voice clinical and devoid of the wonder she once possessed. Or what's left of it. It's the only place heavily warded enough to shield us from Vane's tracking spells. Elias stared at the map. "He's moving fast. Faster than we anticipated," Ron muttered, leaning his hands on the table. The dragonhide armor creaked as he shifted his weight. MACUSA was already bloated with bureaucracy. When Voldemort won in Britain, he didn't even need to send an army here. He sent gold, promises of power, and Silas Vane. Hermione pulled a dossier from a stack and slid it toward Elias. Vane has initiated what he calls the Salem Protocol. It's a twisted inversion of the Nomage Witch trials. He's actively hunting Muggleborns, sympathizers, and anyone who refuses to swear a blood oath to the new regime. He's weaponizing the very secrecy MACUSA relied upon to make people disappear. Elias flipped open the dossier. The pages were filled with moving photographs of missing American witches and wizards, destroyed wands, and burning Nomage homes. It was the same playbook the Death Eaters had used in London, scaled up for a continent. We strike fast, we strike hard, and we fade away before his Dementor squads arrive, Hermione explained, her eyes locking onto Elias. We are drastically outgunned. We need capable fighters. Your record as an Auror is flawless, Thorne. We could use your wand. Elias looked up from the dossier. He didn't care about the map. He didn't care about the American witches and wizards. He cared about the name written on the top of the file. Silas Vane. "I'll fight for you," Elias said, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. "I'll burn his supply lines. I'll break his patrols. Point me at his men, Granger, and I'll kill them." Hermione stared at him, her expression unreadable. She recognized the look in his eyes, the hollow, consuming abyss of a man who is already dead, simply waiting for his body to catch up. She knew he was a liability. But in this war, a lethal liability was still a weapon. "Welcome to the underground, Elias," Hermione said coldly. The freezing fog rolling off Massachusetts Bay was thick enough to taste. It clung to the rusted shipping containers of the Boston harbor like a damp shroud, muffling the sounds of the dark, churning water. Elias crouched atop a stack of wooden crates, his dark coat blending perfectly into the night. Below him, Ron Weasley signaled from the shadows, 2 fingers raised. 2 minutes. Intel had confirmed that a massive shipment of dark artifacts, cursed objects, poisons, and dark detectors imported directly from Borgin and Berks in London, was arriving tonight. Vane planned to use them to fortify his new headquarters in New York. The resistance couldn't allow the shipment to reach him. Through the heavy fog, the silhouette of a massive cargo ship materialized, gliding silently into the dock. There was no hum of a Muggle engine. The ship was propelled purely by wind and dark magic. As the boarding ramp lowered, 6 figures in heavy, black robes disembarked. Death Eaters. They moved with the arrogant swagger of men who believed they owned the night. Move. Ron's voice crackled through the enchanted earpiece Elias wore. Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped from the crates, his boots hitting the damp concrete without a sound. He raised his scavenged hawthorn wand, feeling its familiar, aggressive thrum against his palm. He didn't use a stunning spell. He had no intention of leaving prisoners. Confringo. The blasting curse tore through the fog like a miniature sun, striking the lead Death Eater square in the chest. The man was thrown backward with devastating force, slamming into the steel hull of the ship with a sickening crunch. Chaos erupted. Ron and 3 other resistance fighters emerged from the flanks, unleashing a volley of jinxes and hexes. Red and blue light fractured the darkness. Ambush. Form up. One of the remaining Death Eaters roared, conjuring a massive, shimmering silver shield. Elias advanced, his face an impassive mask of fury. The hawthorn wand seemed to sing in his grip, feeding off his darkest impulses. A Death Eater broke from the formation, aiming a killing curse at a young resistance fighter. Elias didn't cast a shield. He slashed his wand through the air in a vicious, downward arc, Sectum Sempra. The dark cutting curse, a spell Elias had learned from the confiscated files of Severus Snape, struck the Death Eater's wand arm. Blood sprayed into the fog as the man's arm was nearly severed at the elbow. The Death Eater collapsed, screaming in agony. Thorne. Ron yelled over the din of battle, throwing a quick glance at the writhing, bleeding man. Stick to the objective. Elias ignored him. He stalked toward another guard who was attempting to apparate away. Elias jabbed his wand forward. Osseo Dispersimus. It wasn't an unforgivable curse, but it was just as cruel. The bone-shattering hex hit the guard's legs. The man let out a horrific shriek as his femurs splintered into jagged fragments. He crashed to the ground, vomiting from the sheer pain. Clear the ramp. Burn the crates. Ron bellowed, though his eyes lingered on Elias's brutal handiwork. Elias stood over the crippled guard, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying, hollow light. He raised his wand, preparing to finish the job, but a massive explosion of fiend fire erupted from the cargo hold, courtesy of Ron. The cursed fire took the shape of a massive, roaring lion, devouring the dark artifacts in seconds. We're done. Fall back. Ron commanded. Elias lowered his wand, the glow fading. He grabbed the bleeding Death Eater by the collar, dragging him into the shadows before apparating back to Brooklyn. He needed answers, and the dead couldn't speak. The atmosphere in the Blind Pig was usually tense, but tonight, it was entirely suffocating. Elias sat in a dark corner booth, nursing a glass of agonizingly cheap bourbon. His knuckles were bruised, and his coat smelled heavily of ozone and the metallic scent of blood from the Boston raid. Suddenly, the static-filled hum of the magical wireless radios cut out simultaneously. The bluebell flames flickering in the chandeliers dimmed to a sickly, pale white. "Look," someone shouted, pointing toward the center of the room. Above the glowing map of North America, the air began to shimmer and distort. A magical projection, massive and imposingly sharp, materialized in the center of the speakeasy. It was a forced broadcast, hijacking every magical frequency on the continent. The projection displayed a lavish, marble-floored atrium, the main lobby of the MACUSA headquarters. Banners bearing the dark mark had been draped over the golden statues of the founding American wizards. Standing in the center of the room, dressed in immaculate, tailored robes, was Silas Vane. Elias's glass shattered in his grip. The bourbon spilled over his hands, mixing with the blood from small cuts, but he didn't feel it. His breath hitched, his lungs suddenly refusing to draw air. "Witches and Wizards of America." Vane's smooth, aristocratic voice echoed through the speakeasy. It was the exact same tone he had used in the nursery. "For centuries, you have hidden in the dirt. You have allowed the gnomage filth to dictate your existence, cowering behind archaic laws and pathetic secrecy." Vane stepped aside. Two masked Death Eaters dragged a brutally beaten man into the frame, forcing him to his knees. It was Hector Foley, the president of MACUSA. "Today, that era of cowardice ends," Vane declared, his silver mask catching the light. "The Dark Lord offers you freedom. Freedom to rule. Freedom to take your rightful place as the masters of this world. Those who stand in the way of progress will be removed." Elias couldn't hear the rest of the speech. A violent, ringing tinnitus drowned out the room. The marble floors of the MACUSA atrium blurred, replaced by the scorched wallpaper of his London home. Vane's arrogant posture was the same. The casual way he held his wand was the same. Clara on the floor. Leo in her arms. The green flash. Elias was hyperventilating, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The room around him began to spin. He saw Vane raise his wand on the projection. He knew what was coming. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his bleeding hands against his ears. Avada Kedavra. Even through his hands, the green light from the projection violently illuminated the dim speakeasy. Gasps of horror rippled through the resistance fighters. President Foley slumped forward, dead. "Martial law is hereby enacted across all magical territories," Vane's voice concluded smoothly. "Submit or share his fate." The projection fizzled out, plunging the blind pig back into the dim blue light. Elias sat frozen, a cold sweat drenching his back. He didn't realize he was shaking until a hand rested firmly on his shoulder. He flinched violently, his wand instantly in his hand, aimed at the intruder. It was Ron. The redhead didn't look at the wand pointed at his chest. He just looked at Elias's pale, sweat-slicked face. "He's at the Woolworth building," Ron said quietly. "We'll get him, Elias. But not today." Elias lowered his wand, his breathing jagged. The panic attack slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, absolute void. The grief was gone, burned away by the sheer, unadulterated fury that took its place. He didn't need time. He needed a target. The torrential rain of a New York thunderstorm masked the sound of Elias's footsteps as he stalked down a narrow alley in Hell's Kitchen. The gnomages remained indoors, completely oblivious to the predator hunting in their shadows. Elias was operating completely off the grid. He had disabled his earpiece and slipped past the wards of the blind pig hours ago. Hermione's tactical patience was useless to him. He needed actionable intelligence on Silas Vane, and he knew exactly how to get it. He reached the end of the alley, stopping before an abandoned, condemned brownstone. He drew his wand, muttering a complex sequence of unlocking charms and anti-detection wards. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing pitch-black darkness. Elias stepped inside, flicking his wand to ignite a single, harsh magical lumen overhead. In the center of the empty, decaying room, strapped to a rusted metal chair, was the Death Eater he had captured in Boston. The man was in terrible shape. The blood from his nearly severed arm had dried into a dark crust, and his shattered legs hung at unnatural angles. He looked up at Elias, his eyes wide with a mix of defiance and sheer terror. "You're dead, blood traitor," the Death Eater spat, coughing up a mixture of saliva and blood. "When the Envoy finds out you took me..." "The Envoy doesn't care about you," Elias interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. He pulled a wooden chair from the corner and sat directly in front of the captive. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hawthorn wand spinning lazily between his fingers. "You're a foot soldier. Expendable," Elias continued. "But you know the layout of the Woolworth building. You know Vane's security rotations. You know how many Dementors he keeps in the lower levels." "I'll never tell you anything," the man sneered. Elias didn't sigh. He didn't blink. He simply nodded. "I know." He stood up and raised his wand. He didn't want to use legilimency. Delving into the mind of a dark wizard was dangerous, and Elias wasn't a master of the mind arts. He preferred a more direct approach. Crucio. Elias didn't shout the incantation. He whispered it, pouring every ounce of his grief, his nightmares, and his unending rage into the spell. The curse required genuine malice to work, a deep, fundamental desire to cause pain. For the first time in his life, Elias had an infinite supply of it. The red beams struck the Death Eater's chest. The man's body arched violently against the bindings, the rusted chair screeching across the wooden floorboards. A horrific, blood-curdling scream tore from his throat, echoing off the peeling wallpaper of the condemned building. The pain was absolute, like white-hot knives sliding under his skin and acid replacing his blood. Elias held the curse for 10 excruciating seconds before lifting his wand. The captive slumped forward, gasping raggedly, tears streaming down his face. His bravado was entirely gone, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct to make the agony stop. Vane's personal guard, Elias said smoothly, stepping closer. How many? F4. The man sobbed, trembling violently. For inner circle, they never leave his side. The wards on his penthouse, Elias demanded, the tip of his wand glowing a dangerous, angry red. How are they anchored? Blood magic, the man shrieked, cowering away from the light. Tied to the president's corpse. Please, please, I don't know anything else. Elias stared down at the broken man. He had the information he needed. A cold, detached part of his brain, the part that used to be a righteous Auror, screamed at him in horror. He had just used an unforgivable curse. He was becoming the very monster he was trying to destroy. But as the green light of his memory flashed at his mind, that voice was swiftly silenced. Elias raised his wand one last time. A sharp crack of apparition echoed behind him. Expelliarmus. Elias's hawthorn wand was violently ripped from his grip, sailing across the room before he even had time to turn around. He spun, his hand instinctively dropping to the silver goblin dagger hidden in his boot, but he froze. Hermione Granger stood in the doorway, her wand leveled squarely at Elias's chest. Her face was pale, illuminated by the harsh overhead light, but her eyes burned with an unyielding, righteous fury. Ron stood just behind her, his wand also drawn, looking at the tortured, weeping Death Eater bound to the chair. Ron's expression was a mix of shock and profound disgust. Step away from him, Elias, Hermione commanded, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained anger. Elias slowly stood up, holding his empty hands out to his sides. I got the intelligence we needed, he said flatly. Vane's wards are tied to blood magic. For elite guards, I have the rotation schedule. You tortured him, Hermione shouted, taking a step forward. The tip of her wand sparked dangerously. You used the Cruciatus curse. The magical residue in this room is practically choking me. He's a Death Eater. Elias shot back, his voice rising, defensive anger bleeding into his tone. He was at the docks, importing dark artifacts to enslave this city. Do you think he would have hesitated to use it on us? That is exactly the point. Hermione fired back, her voice echoing off the walls. If we use their methods, if we stoop to their level, then what the hell are we fighting for? We are supposed to be the resistance, Elias. We are supposed to represent a better world. If we lose our humanity in the dark, then Voldemort has already won. Elias let out a bitter, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. Humanity? You want to talk to me about humanity, Granger? Humanity died in the Forbidden Forest with Harry Potter. It died when the Ministry fell. It died in my nursery when that bastard butchered my wife and child. Elias took a step toward Hermione, ignoring the wand pointed at his heart. His eyes were wide, manic, completely consumed by the abyss. This isn't a classroom at Hogwarts anymore, Elias snarled. This isn't a duel where we bow before we cast. This is an extermination. They are actively rounding up children and throwing them into camps, and you want to worry about the moral high ground? The moral high ground is a graveyard, Hermione. Elias, enough, Ron rumbled, stepping past Hermione. He kept his wand lowered, but his sheer physical presence was imposing. He looked at Elias, the scarred, hardened veteran looking at a shattered mirror. "I know what it's like to lose family, mate," Ron said quietly. The phantom pain of losing Fred, of losing his parents during the fall of the Burrow, hung heavy in his voice. "I know the rage. It eats you alive from the inside out until there's nothing left but ash. But Hermione is right." Ron gestured to the trembling man in the chair. "If we cross this line, if we become butchers to beat the butchers, then even if we win, we've lost ourselves. We become the next generation of dark wizards." Elias stared at Ron. For a fleeting second, the terrifying, hollow fire in Elias's eyes flickered, replaced by the crushing weight of his unimaginable grief. He looked down at his own hands, trembling slightly, remembering the way Clara used to hold them. "If I don't kill him," Elias whispered, a profound, agonizing crack in his voice, "if I don't tear him apart, then they died for absolutely nothing." Hermione lowered her wand, her anger softening into a heartbreaking pity. "They died because Vane is a monster, Elias. Don't let him turn you into one too." She turned to Ron. "Obliviate the prisoner. Dump him back in the Nomage streets. He'll wake up thinking he's a vagrant." Hermione looked back at Elias, her eyes hardening once more into the steel of a commander. "You're grounded, Thorne. You hand over the intel and you stay in the pig. If you ever use an unforgivable curse under my command again, I won't disarm you. I'll put you down myself." Elias didn't argue. He picked up his wand from the floor, holstered it, and walked out into the pouring rain, the deafening silence of his own mind his only company. The ideological lines were drawn, but Elias knew, deep down, that when the time came to face Vane, neither Ron's empathy nor Hermione's morality would stay his hand. Blood demanded blood. For 2 weeks, Elias Thorne was a ghost within the Resistance. True to her word, Hermione had grounded him. He was confined to the subterranean borders of the Blind Pig, spending his hours sharpening his scavenged hawthorn wand and staring at the glowing map of North America. He was ostracized by the other fighters, a necessary pariah whose ruthless methods terrified the very people he was fighting alongside. But in a war of attrition, morality was a luxury the desperate could rarely afford for long. The fragile peace shattered on a frigid Tuesday morning. The speakeasy's enchanted telegraphs erupted into a chaotic frenzy of clicking metal. Resistance scouts burst through the hidden subway fissure, their faces pale and streaked with soot. Hermione rushed to the central table, slamming a fresh topographical map of the Appalachian Mountains over the war room table. "Report," she barked. "It's Ilvermorny," a scout gasped, clutching a bleeding shoulder. "Vane's forces bypassed the school's wards at dawn. They had inside help. They've segregated the student body. Anyone with Nomage parents, Muggleborns, they've been chained and loaded onto a MACUSA armored transport train." A heavy, sickening silence fell over the speakeasy. "Where is the train bound?" Ron asked, his voice tight. He was leaning over the table, tracing the magical rail lines. "The Northern Territories. Vane has established an internment camp in the deep wilderness. Unplottable. Heavily warded," the scout replied. "If those kids reach the camp, they're gone. We'll never see them again." Hermione's eyes darted across the map, calculating velocities, interception angles, and sheer probabilities. "The train will have to pass through the Shenandoah Valley to avoid Nomage population centers. It's a narrow mountain pass. We can ambush them there. But the transport will be guarded by Vane's elite. We need every wand we have." She looked up, her gaze cutting through the crowd, landing directly on Elias in his dark corner. Elias didn't wait for the invitation. He stepped out of the shadows, fastening his heavy dragonhide coat. "You have a target?" Hermione marched up to him, her expression hardening into absolute granite. "This is a rescue mission, Thorne. Not an assassination, and not a revenge tour. Your objective is the passenger cars. You secure the children and you cover the retreat. If you deviate from the plan, if you jeopardize those kids for your own vendetta—" "I understand," Elias interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He did understand. The children were the priority. But the intelligence he had extracted from the tortured Death Eater burned brightly in his mind. Vane's lieutenants, the elite Inner Circle guards who possessed the access keys to the Woolworth building, were the ones assigned to high-level transports. To get to Vane, Elias needed those keys. He would save the children. But he would bathe the mountain in blood to get what he needed. The Shenandoah Valley was locked in the icy grip of a midnight blizzard. The wind howled through the jagged mountain peaks, whipping thick snow into a blinding frenzy. Elias crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, the freezing cold seeping through his boots, his hawthorn wand drawn and ready. A quarter-mile down the track, Ron and Hermione were setting the trap. Suddenly, the ground began to vibrate. A low, monstrous screech of metal on metal echoed through the valley, slicing through the howling wind. Through the veil of snow, the MACUSA transport train materialized. It was a terrifying, heavily armored beast. There were no windows on the passenger cars, only heavy iron plating etched with glowing, dark magical runes to repel spells. At the front, the engine car billowed thick, black, magically enhanced smoke. Detonate! Hermione's voice crackled through Elias's earpiece. A series of deafening explosions ruptured the night. Magical charges, planted perfectly along the mountain gorge, blew the steel tracks into twisted shrapnel. The train shrieked, the enchanted brakes sparking in brilliant showers of blue and orange light. The massive locomotive violently shuddered, tearing up the frozen earth before slamming into the rock face and grinding to a violent, screeching halt. "Move!" breached the cars. Ron yelled over the comms. Dozens of resistance fighters poured from the tree line, firing concentrated blasting curses at the heavy iron doors of the passenger cars. Elias broke into a sprint, weaving through the snow and the barrage of defensive spells erupting from the train's guards. He was supposed to flank the middle cars and provide cover fire. But as he ran, his eyes locked onto the engine car. Two men emerged from the swirling black smoke of the locomotive. They wore the midnight black robes and gleaming silver masks of Vane's Inner Circle. The lieutenants.
Thorne.
The flank is exposed. Where are you going? Hermione screamed through the earpiece. Elias reached up and ripped the earpiece from his ear, throwing it into the snow. The tunnel vision consumed him. The howling wind faded, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. He vaulted onto the rear coupling of the engine car, his boots slipping on the icy metal, and climbed to the roof. The two lieutenants saw him immediately. "Blood traitor," one roared, unleashing a vicious stream of green light. Elias dropped flat against the frozen iron roof, the killing curse singing mere inches above his head. He rolled, bringing his hawthorn wand up in a fluid, lethal motion. Confringo! The blasting curse hit the roof between the two guards, shattering the iron plating and throwing them off balance. The wind whipped violently, threatening to tear them all from the train. Elias advanced, a predator stalking its prey across the slippery, jagged metal. He parried a bone-shattering hex from the first lieutenant, spinning the raw magical energy off his wand, and countered with a silent, blindingly fast sectum sempra. The dark magic sliced through the frozen air, ripping across the lieutenant's chest. The man collapsed backward, tumbling off the roof and vanishing into the snowy abyss below. The second lieutenant panicked, backing away toward the engine's smokestack. Wait! Wait! Elias didn't speak. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his wand leveled directly between the man's terrified eyes behind the silver mask. "The access keys to the Woolworth penthouse," Elias demanded, his voice colder than the mountain storm. "Give them to me." Trembling, the lieutenant reached into his robes and produced a heavy, dark metal medallion pulsating with blood magic. Elias snatched it. "Please," the man begged. Elias's eyes were dead. He didn't use an unforgivable. He simply kicked out his heavy boot, shattering the man's knee. As the lieutenant screamed and buckled, Elias shoved him hard in the chest. The man tumbled over the edge of the icy roof, plummeting to the frozen rocks below. Elias clutched the medallion, a grim sense of triumph washing over him. He had his key. But as he turned to look down at the passenger cars, the triumph turned to ash in his mouth. Because Elias had abandoned his post, the middle passenger cars were entirely undefended from the rear. Through the swirling snow, Elias watched in horror as a fresh squad of snatchers, who had apparat to the caboose, flanked the resistance fighters. Ron was at the center of the chaos, desperately trying to herd a group of terrified, chained Ilvermorny students toward a glowing blue portkey in the snow. Incoming. Flank right. Ron bellowed, his wand a blur of protective shields. But there were too many. A volley of dark curses rained down on the exposed fighters. Ron threw himself over two young Muggle-born girls, casting a massive Protego Maxima just as a dark purple curse shattered his barrier. The spell struck Ron squarely in the side. Ron let out a choked gasp, his body convulsing as the dark magic ripped through his dragonhide armor. He collapsed into the snow, the white powder around him instantly blooming with a horrifying shade of crimson. "Ron!" Hermione screamed, her voice tearing through the chaos. She abandoned her position, unleashing a terrifying wave of kinetic magic that crushed three snatchers against the side of the train and sprinted to her husband's side. Elias practically threw himself off the roof of the train, landing heavily in the snow. He sprinted toward the breach, his wand firing relentless, concussive blasts to drive the snatchers back. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, slammed into his chest. This was his fault. His vendetta had broken the line. "Get the kids to the portkey. Now," Hermione ordered, her hands glowing with diagnostic magic as she pressed desperately against Ron's bleeding side. "It's a necrotic curse. I can't stop the bleeding here." Elias grabbed the remaining children by their collars, hauling them through the crossfire and shoving them into the glowing perimeter of the portkey. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and ozone. "We have to go," Elias shouted, providing a sweeping shield charm over Hermione and Ron. Hermione grabbed the portkey, a battered Muggle steering wheel, and dragged Ron into the radius. Elias grabbed on just as a dying snatcher on the ground weakly raised his wand, casting a shimmering, silvery tracking charm that splashed silently onto the hem of Elias's coat. With a sickening jerk behind the navel, the frozen mountain vanished. They slammed onto the floorboards of the Blind Pig in Brooklyn. The speakeasy erupted into immediate chaos. Medics rushed forward, levitating a pale, unconscious Ron onto a nearby table. Hermione was covered in her husband's blood. She turned to Elias, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a mixture of grief and absolute betrayal. She didn't need to ask where he had been. She knew. "Get out of my sight," she whispered, her voice shaking with raw emotion. Elias stood in the center of the frantic room, the heavy medallion of Silas Vane burning a hole in his pocket. He had secured his path to revenge, but looking at Ron bleeding out on the table, Elias realized the cost of his soul was too high. He turned to walk away, stepping into the shadows of the underground. But before he could leave, the temperature in the Blind Pig plummeted to absolute zero. The blue bell flames in the speakeasy chandeliers violently flickered and died. A thick, unnatural frost spiderwebbed across the mirrored walls and cracked tile floors. The frenetic shouting of the medics ceased, replaced by a collective, horrified gasp that was instantly visible in the freezing air. "They tracked us," someone whispered in the dark. A heavy, unnatural silence pressed against Elias's eardrums, followed by the terrifying, rattling breath of the damned. The heavily warded brick walls of the subway fissure simply decayed, turning to ash under the overwhelming presence of dark magic. Black, hooded figures floated effortlessly through the breach. Dementors. Dozens of them. The Snatcher's tracking charm had led Vane's extermination squad directly to their doorstep. Screams erupted as the Dementors descended. Resistance fighters who had just survived the mountain ambush found themselves paralyzed, their happiest memories violently sucked from their minds, leaving only their worst nightmares. "Cast your Patronuses. Shield the wounded," Hermione ordered, her voice cutting through the despair. She raised her wand, her hands shaking, and shouted, "Expecto Patronum." A silver otter burst from her wand, illuminating the center of the room and driving back a pair of advancing Dementors. A few other fighters managed to produce weak, flickering shields of silver light, but it wasn't enough. The sheer volume of the Dementor swarm was suffocating the room in darkness. 3 Dementors bypassed the front line, gliding silently toward the makeshift medical table where Ron lay defenseless. Hermione turned, her eyes widening in absolute terror. She was too far away. Her otter was engaged. She couldn't reach him in time. Elias watched the cloaked horrors approach his fallen commander. The despair radiating from them washed over him. The voices started in his head. Clara screaming, Leo crying, the green flash. It was the same loop of agony that had fueled his rage for 6 months. He had embraced the darkness to survive it. But looking at Hermione's terrified face, looking at Ron bleeding on the table, the people who had taken him in when he was nothing but a broken weapon, something shifted deep within his fractured soul. Revenge wouldn't bring his family back. It would only create more corpses. If he let Ron die here, Elias was no better than Silas Vane. Elias stepped directly into the path of the 3 Dementors. He closed his eyes, pushing past the memory of the green light. He dug deeper, clawing through the ash of his grief, until he found it. A sunny afternoon in Islington. The smell of fresh-cut grass. Clara laughing as 4-year-old Leo, clutching a toy broomstick, confidently declared he was going to be the best chaser in the world. The absolute, unconditional love that made life worth living. Elias opened his eyes, raising his hawthorn wand. Expecto Patronum. The spell didn't just cast, it erupted. It wasn't the silver wolf of his past, as an Auror. A blinding, searing shockwave of pure, condensed silver light exploded from the tip of his wand, illuminating the entire subterranean speakeasy like a second sun. The light coalesced, taking form. It was a silver, glowing child, riding a tiny broomstick. The Patronus zoomed through the air, leaving a trail of warm, blinding hope in its wake. It laughed, a joyous, echoing sound that shattered the icy dread in the room. The child swooped over Ron's table, directly impacting the 3 Dementors. The dark creatures shrieked in agony, violently repelled by the raw, untainted emotion, and fled toward the ceiling. The massive wave of positive energy rippled outward, empowering the other fighters' spells, driving the entire swarm back toward the fissure. The emergency tunnels, Hermione yelled, seizing the momentary reprieve. Evacuate. Now. Fighters grabbed the wounded, pulling them toward the hidden blast doors at the rear of the speakeasy. Elias stood his ground, maintaining his Patronus, the silver child circling him protectively as he watched the last of the resistance flee. He had saved them. He had remembered how to protect, rather than just destroy. But as he backed into the evacuation tunnel and sealed the heavy iron doors, leaving the blind pig to the dark, he knew the war was far from over. The new safe house was a miserable, damp maintenance room deep beneath the Manhattan Bridge, humming with the sound of Nomage subway trains rattling overhead. It smelled of mildew and stale blood. The resistance had been decimated. They had lost their base, much of their supplies, and several good fighters. Ron survived the necrotic curse, thanks to Hermione's frantic healing, but he was bedridden, pale, and incredibly weak. The Ilvermorny children were safe, smuggled out through the Canadian border via a secondary underground network, but the victory felt entirely hollow. Hermione sat at a small, rusted metal desk, staring blankly at a stolen magical wireless radio. Elias stood by the reinforced door, his hawthorn wand holstered, the silence between them heavy and complicated. "Thank you," Hermione said softly, not looking up from the radio. "For saving him. For saving us." Elias nodded slowly. "I broke the line on the train. I owed you that." "Your Patronus changed," she observed, her voice devoid of judgment, only quiet understanding. "That doesn't happen unless a person's fundamental core has been fundamentally shaken." "I remembered why I started fighting in the first place," Elias replied, leaning against the cold, concrete wall. "I lost sight of it. I'm sorry, Hermione." It was the first time since London he had apologized. It was the first time he felt like a human being, rather than a ghost haunting his own life. The magical radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking the tense quiet. It wasn't a static-filled broadcast. It was a clear, haughty transmission from MACUSA headquarters. Preparations are nearly complete for the Envoy's victory gala. Tomorrow night, at the peak of the Woolworth building, Lord Vane will host the elite of the new American regime to celebrate the eradication of the terrorist cell in Brooklyn. The continent is secure. Hermione reached out and clicked the radio off. She sat in silence for a long moment, the rhythmic rumbling of the Muggle train overhead vibrating through the floorboards. When she finally looked up at Elias, the calculating, ruthless tactician had returned to her eyes. "We can't win a guerrilla war anymore," Hermione stated coldly. "We don't have the numbers. We don't have a base. Vane is throwing a party to celebrate our deaths, while all his top lieutenants and financial backers are in one room." Elias stood up straighter, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the heavy, dark metal medallion he had taken from the lieutenant on the train. He placed it gently on the rusted desk between them. "The blood wards on the Woolworth penthouse," Elias said quietly. "This bypasses them." Hermione stared at the medallion. She traced the dark runes with her finger, her mind working 1,000,000 miles a minute. She looked at Elias, seeing the resolve in his eyes. It wasn't the manic, bloodthirsty rage of a man seeking revenge anymore. It was the cold, unyielding determination of a soldier ready to fall on his sword to win the war. "A decapitation strike," Hermione whispered. "If we take out Vane and his inner circle tomorrow night, the new regime loses its anchor in America. The local warlords will fracture. It gives the rest of the country a chance to fight back." "It's a fortress, Hermione," Elias warned. "Even with the key, getting to the top floor is a suicide mission." "I know," Hermione said, standing up. She looked toward the small cot where Ron was sleeping, her expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening into absolute steel. "But it's the only play we have left." Elias nodded. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, eerie peace. The path was set. He would walk into the lion's den. He would tear down the architect of his nightmares, and he would not be walking out. The vengeance strike was on. The damp maintenance room beneath the Manhattan Bridge had become a war room of desperate, fatalistic industry. Ron Weasley sat at the rusted metal desk, his face pallid and shining with cold sweat. He was heavily bandaged, kept upright only by a lethal dosage of blood-replenishing potions and sheer, stubborn grit. Before him lay a chaotic assortment of Nomage C4 explosives, blasting caps, and intricate glass vials glowing with the trapped, violent orange embers of dormant fiend fire. "The structural wards on the Woolworth building are anchored to the bedrock," Hermione explained, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she etched containment runes onto the glass vials. "Standard blasting curses will just bounce off. We have to shatter the foundations simultaneously from the inside out. Muggle explosives to breach the physical pillars, fiend fire to consume the magical anchors," Ron grunted, carefully wiring a blasting cap. He winced, a spasm of pain crossing his scarred face. "It's a dirty bomb, Hermione. Once the cursed fire is unleashed in a confined space, there's no putting it out. The whole tower is going to come down." "I know," Hermione said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "That's the point." In the darkest corner of the room, Elias Thorne sat on an overturned bucket, deaf to the technical logistics of the explosives. He held a crumpled piece of parchment and a self-inking quill. He was writing a letter. "Clara, Leo. I don't know if the dead can read, or if you can even see me from wherever you are. I hope you can't. I've done terrible things. I became the nightmare we used to hide from. But tonight it ends. I am coming home to you." Elias folded the parchment carefully. He drew his hawthorn wand, tapped the paper, and whispered, "Incendio." The parchment caught fire, burning with a pure, white flame. He watched the smoke curl upward, vanishing into the damp ceiling, carrying his final confession to the afterlife. He stood up, his joints popping, and strapped his dragon hide coat tight across his chest. He checked his boots, ensuring the goblin-wrought silver dagger was secure, and slipped the heavy, blood magic medallion into his inner pocket. Hermione walked over to him. She handed him a small, enchanted earpiece. Ron and I will breach the lobby. We'll trigger the explosives and draw the heavy guard down to the ground floor. The gala is on the 60th floor, but Vane's private penthouse is on the 61st. The medallion will allow you to bypass the elevator lockdown. You're both in no condition to fight a ground war, Elias said, looking at Ron's trembling hands. We don't have to win, Ron said, flashing a grim, jagged smile. We just have to be loud enough to make them look away from you. You have exactly 10 minutes to end Silas Vane before the fiend fire reaches the penthouse. If you aren't out by then, I won't be, Elias said simply. Hermione's breath hitched, but she didn't argue. She reached out and gripped his shoulder, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Give them hell, Elias. For London, Elias whispered. For all of us, she replied. Nature itself seemed to protest the existence of Voldemort's American empire. A massive, violent thunderstorm raged over New York City. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, striking the enchanted lightning rods of the Woolworth building, illuminating the massive banners bearing the dark mark that hung from its Gothic, terracotta facade. Elias stood in the shadows of an alleyway across Broadway, the torrential rain instantly soaking his hair. A block away, parked illegally on the curb, was a stolen Nomage panel van holding Ron, Hermione, and enough explosive power to level a city block. In position, Hermione's voice crackled through Elias's earpiece, barely audible over the roaring thunder. Detonation in 3, 2, 1. The street violently heaved. A deafening, earth-shattering boom ripped through the financial district. The heavy, ornate brass doors of the Woolworth building were blown entirely off their hinges, sailing through the air and crushing a marble fountain in the lobby. Immediately, the night erupted into chaos. Alarms shrieked, a piercing, magical wail that rattled Elias's teeth. Snatchers and Death Eaters poured out of the upper levels, swarming the lobby like angry hornets. Flashes of red, green, and purple light illuminated the blowing rain as Ron and Hermione opened fire from the cover of the van, unleashing a barrage of kinetic spells that shredded the lobby's defenses. They're taking the bait. Go! Ron yelled over the comms. Elias sprinted across the flooded street, invisible in the chaos and the driving rain. He slipped through a shattered side window, dropping into a darkened security corridor. He could hear the ferocious battle raging in the grand atrium, the air already growing thick and hot from the preliminary sparks of fiend fire. He moved like a ghost, his wand raised, navigating the labyrinthine halls until he reached the private executive elevator, a gilded cage of iron and brass. The doors were sealed tight, glowing with the dark, necrotic energy of Vane's blood wards. Elias pulled the heavy metal medallion from his coat and pressed it against the center of the doors. The dark magic hissed, curling around the metal like physical smoke, before recognizing the magical signature. With a heavy, metallic groan, the wards dropped, and the doors slid open. Elias stepped inside, hitting the button for the 61st floor. The elevator jolted upward, accelerating at a stomach-churning speed. The sounds of the battle faded, replaced by the hum of the ascending cables and the rhythmic pounding of his own heart. He closed his eyes. He didn't think of Clara or Leo. He didn't think of the hollow grief. He emptied his mind, transforming himself into a sheer, unfeeling instrument of violence. When the elevator dinged, announcing his arrival at the top of the world, Elias Thorne was ready to kill. The elevator doors parted to reveal a lavish, mahogany-paneled antechamber. The air here was entirely different. It smelled of expensive cigars, fine wine, and the suffocating arrogance of absolute power. Muffled classical music drifted up from the gala taking place one floor below. Standing between Elias and the heavy double doors of the penthouse office were Vane's elite guard. 4 inner-circle Death Eaters, dressed in immaculate combat robes, their silver masks reflecting the dim ambient light. The perimeter is breached, one of them hissed, drawing his wand. Kill him. Elias didn't wait for them to cast. He lunged out of the elevator, moving with blinding speed. Expulso. The concussive blast struck the nearest guard, blowing him backward through a priceless antique vase. The remaining 3 returned fire instantly. A chaotic web of lethal curses filled the narrow antechamber. Elias dove behind a heavy marble pillar, chips of stone raining down on his head as a killing curse grazed his cover. He couldn't engage them in a prolonged duel. They were fresh, elite, and possessed the high ground. He needed to be ruthless. Elias rolled out from behind the pillar, casting a localized, blinding flash of light. Lumos Maxima. As the guards flinched, shielding their eyes, Elias flicked his wand in a vicious, tearing motion. Defendo. The severing charm wasn't aimed at a person. It was aimed at the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above the guards. The chain snapped. The massive construct of enchanted glass and iron plummeted, crushing one guard instantly beneath its massive weight. "You filthy half-blood," the third guard roared, stepping over his fallen comrade and unleashing a torrent of black, whip-like magical flames. The dark flames wrapped around Elias's left arm, searing through the dragonhide coat and burning into his flesh. Elias gritted his teeth, swallowing the scream. He didn't try to extinguish the flames. He used the tether. He violently yanked his arm backward, throwing the guard off balance, and pointed his hawthorn wand directly at the man's chest. Sectum Sempra. The cutting curse tore through the guard's robes, painting the mahogany walls crimson. The man dropped, gargling on his own blood. The final guard panicked. He backed toward the penthouse doors, raising his wand to cast the alarm ward, but Elias was already moving. Ignoring the agonizing burns on his arm, Elias closed the distance, tackling the man through the heavy oak doors of the office. They crashed onto the plush carpet of Silas Vane's inner sanctum. The guard scrambled to raise his wand, but Elias was faster. He brought the heavy hilt of his hawthorn wand down brutally against the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. Elias stood up, his chest heaving, his left arm hanging limply at his side, the smell of his own burned flesh filling his nose. Blood dripped from a cut above his eye, stinging his vision. He looked up. The office was massive, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the storm-ravaged New York skyline. Lightning flashed, illuminating the silhouette of a man standing calmly by his mahogany desk, pouring a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Silas Vane turned around, the glass in his hand, his face unmasked. He looked exactly the same as he did in the nursery, arrogant, pristine, and utterly devoid of humanity. "I must admit," Vane drawled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I am genuinely surprised. The Auror from Islington. I thought I left you under the rubble." The glass of the floor-to-ceiling window exploded inward in a shower of deadly shrapnel. Elias didn't flinch, expecting the fire to consume him. But instead of heat, a freezing gust of storm-whipped wind blasted into the room, momentarily pushing the fiend fire back. Something massive, skeletal, and leathery crashed onto the floor of the penthouse. Elias opened his eyes. A thestral, a winged horse of death, visible only to those who had witnessed it, was stamping its hooves frantically on the burning carpet. And leaning over its bony neck, his face pale and contorted in agony, was Ron Weasley.
"Thorne, get up."
Ron bellowed over the roar of the storm and the flames. "Get on the bloody horse." Elias stared at him, paralyzed by exhaustion and a profound desire to let it all end. "Go." Elias coughed, blood spilling over his lips. "I'm done." "You don't get to choose when it ends," Ron roared, steering the terrified Thestral closer, ignoring the encroaching wall of cursed fire. "You saved us in the tunnels. Now I'm saving you. Move your arse, Elias, or I swear to Merlin I'll drag you." The sheer, stubborn defiance in Ron's voice pierced through Elias's fatalistic stupor. He saw the way Ron was bleeding, risking his own fragile life to pull a broken man from the fire. Elias realized that while he had lost his family, he had accidentally forged a new one in the dark. Gritting his teeth against the agonizing pain of his broken ribs, Elias rolled onto his stomach and pushed himself up. The flaming serpent lunged. Elias threw himself forward, grabbing Ron's outstretched hand. Ron hauled him up with surprising strength, pulling Elias onto the back of the Thestral just as the fiend fire consumed the space where he had been lying.
Hold on,
Ron shouted, spurring the beast forward. The Thestral shrieked, launching itself out of the shattered window and diving directly into the violent thunderstorm. They plummeted for several terrifying seconds before the massive, leathery wings caught the updraft. The Thestral leveled out, soaring over the flooded streets of Manhattan. Elias clung to Ron's waist, the freezing rain washing the blood and soot from his face. Behind them, the Woolworth building was a towering inferno. The magical foundation shattered. With a sound like a dying titan, the massive skyscraper began to crumble, imploding inward under the sheer, devastating force of the fiend fire and the Muggle explosives. As the building fell, Elias looked up at the sky. The colossal, glowing green dark mark that had hovered over New York City since Vane's arrival violently flickered. Without the blood wards, without the Envoy's anchor, the magic destabilized. The snake writhed, the skull dissolved, and the mark shattered into a million dissipating green sparks, leaving nothing but the natural, chaotic beauty of the storm. Down in the streets, cheers began to echo over the thunder. Not from the Death Eaters, who were fleeing in terror, but from the shadows. The hidden witches and wizards, the oppressed, the resistance, they saw the tower fall.
They saw the mark break.
Elias looked down at his burned, bloody hands. He was irrevocably broken. He would never be the man he was in London. He was a weapon forged in tragedy, destined to carry the ghosts of Clara and Leo until his dying breath. But as the Thestral banked toward Brooklyn, carrying them away from the wreckage of Voldemort's shattered American stronghold, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in 6 agonizing months. It was fragile, frightening, and undeniably real.
Hope.
The war was not over. The Dark Lord still reigned across the ocean. But the invincibility of his empire had been broken. The American resistance had ignited, and Elias Thorne, the man who had lost everything, was finally ready to fight for the living. The American empire is burning, but the global war is far from over. What did you think of this darker, ruthless wizarding world? If you had to survive in this timeline, which path would you choose? Hermione's calculated resistance, or Elias's brutal path of revenge? Type resistance or revenge in the comments below to let me know where you stand. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.